what we're going to look at now in the kind of the second half is we're going to continue to look at that evolution of power, right? Like federalism, what we've seen is in spite of the intent to kind of restrain the office, we need it, but we want to restrain it, there's been this evolution of the office where power has been concentrated in the hands of the executive. And we want to know why, and then we want to, because we're AP, analyze the larger impact of that, right? What's the larger impact of an expanded and more powerful executive branch on the political process? Okay, so what we look at today is simply, again, constitutional provisions that have given the president power with respect to the other branches. And what we're going to look at is not just it on paper, but some of the subtleties of it. How has that power perhaps evolved a little bit? Now, chief among the president's powers is the power to execute. And what I'm indicating here is, and what we've gone over before, is that concept is kind of intentionally vague. The language is intentionally vague, and it's allowed the president to define, in many ways, how they see executive power, to claim in some ways the power to shape and almost legislate. All right? So when we talk executive power, again, Article 2, Section 1 says that executive power is vested in the President of the United States and that they shall take care that laws be faithfully executed. There's their wiggle room with this idea of kind of faithfully executed. On a simple level, what it means to execute is to carry out, to administer. You have laws. I think I put them back. I haven't. I've held up the congressional record in the Federal Register for you guys, and now I've kind of misplaced it somewhere. You have Congress pass laws, but they can't think of every single detail that's essential in executing and carrying out that law. That's the job of the executive. The law comes to them, they assign it to an executive agency, and then they go through the process of implementing that law. And then as issues come up, the executive agencies make rulings, they make decisions, they hold hearings, they gather information, and they revise and adjust as they go, okay? So that job, that simple act of kind of carrying it out, gives the president a tremendous amount of power. When you look at, assigning it to agencies and departments, there's over 3 million executive branch workers. And as dull as it was, you read about it when you looked at the bureaucracy, right? The budget. If you go into the executive branch website, what you're going to see is all the departments and agencies that the president is in charge of kind of directing and coordinating. And as I see, like the Department of Agriculture, for example, if there's a farm bill, we're going to assign it to the Department of Agriculture and all those workers. What you notice is, and I'm not going to do it, but if I click on each of these kind of links, there's offices or departments under that larger heading. It gets kind of sprawling. Within each of these is hundreds, within the Forest Service, there's smaller departments and agencies and hundreds of federal workers carrying out the tasks of carrying out law. So, here are all these things that I could open up. And I'm just kind of scrolling to show you the scope of it. But again, picture clicking on all of those. The president has the ability to fund these, not necessarily, I said that wrong. The president submits the budget to fund these departments and agencies. Again, how much roughly do we kind of bring in and spend? I know there's a difference, but what kind of budget are we talking about? What column am I in? Hundreds, thousands, trillions? How many trillion? Right around 3 with both numbers. It's a high 2 and a low 3, right? So when you begin to kind of look at that 3 trillion and talk about how it's distributed, the president submits a plan, and they have a plan to robustly maybe fund the Department of Defense and the intelligence program, and maybe not so much with the Department of Education. And that, again, is going to have an impact on the ability to implement legislation. If a department is overfunded or underfunded, overstaffed or understaffed. So again, I could open each of these up. You can see that they're, PDF files that go with each of these. And there's a pretty complex plan in terms of the overall budget. To look at it more simply, you're going to want to know trends. And when we do the kind of our unit on fiscal policy, we'll get into this more specifically. But for right now, again, what's our biggest expenditure? Yeah, the entitlement programs. More specifically, which entitlement program? Social Security, right? We spend a lot, obviously, on the elderly because when you bring in Medicare and Medicaid, more so Medicaid, some elderly are both elderly and low income. So that's why I include both those policies. But Medicare is the one specifically for them. We spend a lot on the elderly. Once I look at the entitlement programs, what's our next biggest expenditure? Defense, right? And especially if there's a protracted kind of conflict in the years where we were both in Iraq and Afghanistan, defense spending was eclipsing the spending we were doing on Social Security. And then you've got, your other categories. We'll look at those more specifically later. But for our purposes right now, what I want you to see is the president, in executing law, has some pretty sophisticated tools. He's got a pretty sophisticated infrastructure and an ability to use the budget to maximize that infrastructure, right? However, we can go beyond that because, again, to execute, to carry out, and to faithfully execute gives the president some wiggle room. The president can say, well, the law says this, but this is how I see it. This is what I believe is in order. A lot of times, too, they'll kind of talk about, an executive mandate to ensure national security. And they'll use that as a filter when they look at law. All right, I've got, I'm going to show it to you in a second. I've got these laws coming about that have to do with torture bans and, not using enhanced interrogation techniques. But I'm going to look at that through the filter of my executive mandate to maintain national security, and therefore here's how I see the law and why I'm going to interpret it differently, okay? When they want to, essentially reinterpret a law, there's a number of tools that they have. Executive orders is a way to kind of bypass the whole process as a whole. To essentially say, I'm going to issue an executive order to my departments and agencies. It has the binding force of law, and I don't have to go through the legislative branch. The check on that would be as if it was unconstitutional and Congress chose to challenge it, either by issuing a law that countermanded the executive order or, bringing a suit. As long as there's not an executive order, that statement, that document that the president issued as a force of law stands. Does anybody know any classic executive orders? There's a few kind of famous ones.
Is 8802 the internment?
Japanese internment camps, and people tend to remember, these are famous enough executive orders that people sometimes remember the numbers, that 8802, right? So ordering that Japanese Americans be placed in internment camps during World War II. There's one by Truman, too. Sometimes people remember.
That's where he
desegregates the army. That's an executive order. So having some of those more famous ones at your disposal is good because remember, we're not just kind of identifying, we're illustrating when we write, right? And then we analyze. So, okay, executive orders. The other thing that we talked about too were the signing statements. You guys remember that? So I can, when I'm signing a law into effect, I can, in a public kind of statement, go on record and say, this is how I see the law and how I intend to interpret it. It again is a way that the president is assigning it and directing it through his departments and agencies. But the public nature of it is what's significant. He's also setting a public tone, basically trying to control the public perception and the discourse that happens. So that's why the signing statement in some ways is taking it, I think, to the next level. Now, just to kind of give you guys a little flesh to the bone, George W. Bush used this more than his predecessors. He used it to the point where he got fairly criticized. What's interesting is, and I'm going to show you an article in a second, as much as the Democrats criticized Bush for using it, they themselves are not above using signing statements, and Obama has certainly followed suit. It's become a tool that either side has been using increasingly. So in a second, I'll kind of show you numbers, but if we scan through, it gets to a point where they list. Well, I'm not gonna delay too much here. There's a couple of places where, as you know, they kind of go into a list fashion, and it will say things like, there's an order that the president has to report on the conditions and treatments of detainees. And Bush in his signing statement says, based on executive privilege and national security, I don't have to report on that. And so it just kind of completely counters the law. It talks about kind of the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. And again, there's Bush's interpretation. And again, a lot of criticism. But when you look, you know, what you see here is the number of kind of statements. You know, Obama has used quite a few himself. Now, these are where the statements are challenges, kind of in direct contradiction to the law, okay? And what I'll do is I'm going to print up one of these documents, and I'll have you kind of read through, because it's really interesting to see, rather than me just show it to you on the screen, here's the law, here's the interpretation. Here's the law, here's the interpretation. So I'm going to remember that, and we'll kind of kick off class tomorrow maybe with reading that, all right? So, again, I want you just to think about the structure of what we just looked at. We've looked at kind of the power on paper. You have the power to execute. You have an ability to define it, but you understand on a higher level how the president uses that power to go beyond maybe what's on paper through, you know, the sophisticated use of the executive infrastructure, through the use of the budget, through the use of executive orders, through the use of signing statements. Your heads that you heard me, right? Okay. Now, here's another, again, power on paper. In a way, again, we were thinking of these as checks because the Congress has the power to wage war, but the president is given power as commander-in-chief. I just said that backwards. Congress is given the power to declare war, but the president is given power as commander-in-chief. And again, what you guys know is that the president has used that term and that responsibility to direct war, to become the one that wages war. And again, we talked about this before, but largely Congress defers to that and allows the executive branch, in spite of what was in the Constitution, to have, you know, kind of dominance or jurisdiction in this area, all right? So this commander-in-chief position makes the power to declare war secondary. Examples, right? You know, World War II was the last officially declared war, and there were some major encounters, quite a few. When you remember that list I brought up for you guys, all the military encounters, remember from that Department of Navy page? There's a ton of encounters ever since then. The most notable armed conflicts, obviously, would be Vietnam, you know, Korea, Vietnam. We've got Gulf Wars. We've got Iraq, Afghanistan. we were in the conflict and the ethnic cleansing that occurred in Yugoslavia. We were in all kinds of African nations. It goes on and on and on. So there's plenty of evidence to indicate that the president's power as commander in chief really does make the power to declare a war secondary. Again, you guys know about the War Powers Act. What event does that follow? What's that in response to? Anytime I really have a reform moment, it's after the Vietnam War. We're talking kind of, we're at the Nixon administration again. We've got Watergate, we've got Vietnam, and a bunch of reform kind of follows. So this is in response to the Vietnam War and what seemed to be an irresponsible, I suppose, use of the executive power to wage war because as we're trying to, as the public increasingly wants a de-escalation of that conflict, what we see is an escalation, a way to kind of escalate in order to get out. So what we have is 3 constraints placed on the president. Do you remember? What are the constraints placed on the president with regards to war? With regards to conflict? What's the first?
After they deploy troops, they have 60 days to get approval from Congress.
Good. So I'm going to do that as number 2. What's the first thing the president needs to do if he's going to deploy those troops? And there's a timetable. Do you remember, Nick?
48 hours for congressional approval.
Well, not approval, but I've got to do something. You're right. There's a 48-hour window. I got a 2-day window to do something when I want to send troops. And then there's a catch. I got to notify Congress. I've got 48 hours to notify Congress, comma, and here comes my wiggle room. Say it again. If possible, right? And I can say it's not possible because of what? Why would I not want to tell 535 members where I'm sending troops and why? Yeah, national security, right? Then, once I've got them deployed, I've got a window, I've got a timetable to kind of keep them there. I can deploy troops for 60 days without congressional approval. And if I don't get that approval, does anybody remember the next kind of timetable? Go ahead, Liam.
30 days.
30 days to withdraw, okay? And if at any time Congress doesn't like that, regardless of whether it's after the 90 days or during the 90 days, what can they do? Let's say like we're at day 10 and Congress kind of finds out we don't like that. What can they do? Call the troops home. In some ways, that may look like a legislative veto, right? Remember that? And for that reason, that one may be questionable as well. Anybody remember the Supreme Court case that ruled executive vetoes? INS versus Child, right? So, again, we've got some subtleties here. We have the executive branch using a vague provision to claim expanded powers. Congress largely allows that. Even their effort to restrain the president was largely ineffective. And they don't seem to care. In other words, the president expanded in this area. They did a kind of initially well-intended effort to restrain the president, but I think it's Congress that really soured on that need to restrain the president. How come? Why does Congress defer to the president so much? It has a lot to do with the nature of war. Why would Congress not decide to kind of really stick to this or call the president on it? What do you think, Kelly?
Well, you would just signal SWIFT versus act.
Yeah, this is war. This is where there's been an attack. There's been a threat to national security. You need decisive and swift action, right? Not necessarily a lot of wrangling going on. They defer because of the nature of war. And again, talk to me about credit and blame. Again, why would they defer? With regards to credit and blame? Go ahead.
They'd rather put the weight on the president's shoulders instead of.
Wars are going to, and there's going to be an initial rally around the president. We have learned from Vietnam to, maybe question certain armed conflict, but, don't throw the troops under the bus in the process. We tend to show a lot of unconditional support for the troops. In order for that to be conveyed, the easiest way to show that support is to support the president. It's called rallying around the president. It's our nationalism kicks in. We immediately support the president. Popularity rates go up. But the second that conflict begins to drag on, the second you begin to see, soldiers' coffins, flag-draped coffins returning, public perception and support begins to dip. And Congress largely, I think, looks to avoid that kind of lightning rod stuff. You've got a 90% incumbency rate. I just have to continue to bring services to my district. Let the president kind of take on that. There's a kind of a deliberate nature to that. Now, the next one we'll talk about, and this one always kind of, for whatever reason, this one seems to be like the most troubling to students sometimes. This because it is so, I suppose, final. A lot of checks you still can kind of talk about, the continue that talk about the game of cat and mouse. That, even if the president vetoes, there's still options. Even if Congress overrides, there's still options. All right? With pardoning, I think it's some of the, just that unilateral and final kind of power. Because what the president has is the power to immediately pardon someone of a federal crime and, commute their sentence, remove them from prison, and immediately kind of, restore their rights. It seems fairly arbitrary. So why is it there? Why would you give the executive branch this power to immediately, someone has been sentenced, someone has been convicted, they're in jail, and the president has the power to reach in and kind of commute their sentence, to pull them out and restore rights. Why? Is there any logic to that? What do you think? Good. If someone is wrongfully convicted, how quickly do you have to fix that? Immediately, right? Who's the only one who can immediately fix it? Okay? There's the logic. Can you think of anything worse, any worse transgression than wrongfully convicting someone? Right? You can't give them back the time. You can't give them back whatever kind of damage you've done to reputation and their psyche. But what you can do is immediately fix it. And the only one that can immediately fix it is the president. Okay? So that's why the power is there on paper. But what you see, again, if we're looking under the surface, is a somewhat self-serving use of it. How many cases a year are there wrongful convictions? There are certainly some, and legal scholars would tell you probably more than I'm giving credit to. But where we see presidents using it more so is to kind of use it as a political tool. For example, Ford pardons Nixon. Nixon resigns before the charges had been brought, and we begin to enter that trial phase of the impeachment process. Doesn't mean the crime goes away of cover-up, of perjury. There's a lot of people still calling for Nixon's head. And what Ford decided was it would be better for the nation to put this issue to rest. I can't pardon someone for impeachment, but I can pardon them for crimes before there is impeachment. And maybe this will speed us, into healing. Well, arguably it worked, but it causes Ford to be a one-term president. Carter uses it to forgive a lot of the people that avoided Vietnam by seeking asylum in other countries. People that went up into Canada to avoid the, either registering for the draft or, when they were called out for the draft. So there's a full 10,000 that fled the country to avoid the draft. Carter pardons them. Again, it kind of closes a chapter. It might be healing. Carter, however, is also a one-term president, right? You guys really probably didn't get into as much as I would like the Iran-Contra scandal. Does that sound familiar at all? How many of you remember studying it? Okay, so some of you have a vague familiarity in it. What happened in Iran? What did the Iranians do?
Wasn't there like a hostage
Good.
situation?
And we tend not to negotiate when it comes to a hostage situation because it may allow you to get the hostages immediately free, but it also sets a precedent of, hey, it worked. I had hostages and they paid. Let's take more hostages. So we have kind of strict policies against paying for hostages, except in this case we did, right? Through back channels. Does anybody remember who the Contras are? Where else are we?
Rebels in Central America.
Good. They are fighting to overthrow what kind of government? Do you remember just in general why we liked them?
Like a communist.
Yeah, they're kind of rebels fighting to overthrow a communist regime in Nicaragua. Now they've got their own kind of reasons to kind of question them, and Congress doesn't want to get sucked into this, so they pass a law saying we're not going to support the Contras. We're not going to give them arms. We're not going to get kind of pulled into that. That's a muddy, murky situation. In spite of that congressional law that says don't trade arms with the Contras, we did so anyways, and we funneled the proceeds to the Iranians to pay for the hostage release. Incredibly scandalous as it comes out. And what's interesting is this is under the Reagan administration. A lot of people just kind of play the Fifth Amendment or I forget. And given the complexity of the executive branch, it works to a certain extent. There's only a handful of people that are really held accountable for this, but there's a lot of others that kind of remain under suspicion. Well, when Bush comes in, he essentially ends the investigation and he pardons some of the top level individuals. Again, Bush, this is George Herbert Walker, one-term president. So for a lot of them, you see them using it maybe to kind of put to rest certain scandals, and there's political damage. A lot of them, to kind of illustrate with Clinton, use it towards the end of their term. And again, it's both that kind of end scandals, but it may be also as a way of well, with Clinton, there's 140 individuals that he pardons that he does in the kind of final hours before leaving office. A lot of it has to do with the partisan nature of Congress and certain individuals being under suspicion and being kind of charged with, among other things, financial impropriety. And maybe there's a political spin to it, but there's also a criminal side to it. And at any rate, he's doing it in the last hours, and that ought to tell you something. If he's doing it in the middle of his term, then that's subject to public debate. If I'm doing this on my way out, this may be a way of doing something that would normally have political damage. What the long-term damage is the damage to his legacy, though. Presidents who look like they're using a constitutional power for, I don't want to say personal, but kind of political gain, certainly get kind of, there's damage to their reputation. So understand that this is an interesting tool that has a real important reason it's there. It's rarely used for that reason. Rarely are we pardoning the kind of the innocent as an immediate kind of way to fix things. All right, power of appointment. You guys know this one. What you have to remember is the power of appointment is more than just Supreme Court justices, right? Or the ability to kind of appoint people. So the president has a number of things that they can do that the Senate in turn checks. And when I'm talking about appointment, it's not just Supreme Court justices, it's the lower federal courts, it's ambassadors, it's people to the departments and agencies, and a lot of them are going to be constitutionally checked by the Senate via their power of advice and consent. I also throw in here the idea this isn't an appointment, but that power of advice and consent also extends to treaties. Do remember that, okay? So this is a pretty effective tool because like I showed you, there's 3 million executive branch workers. The court system is filled with opportunities for kind of appointment. on average, what we're looking at is the ability to kind of put in 3,000 appointees who are in charge of the daily implementation of law and the direction of public policy. And typically, historically, the president has a pretty high confirmation rate. There's not a lot of challenge to this. You saw that with the Supreme Court, there's like an 88% success rate. With these executive branch workers, these 3,000 executive branch workers that the president gets to put in place, there's like an historic 97% confirmation rate. However, again, we've become increasingly contentious in Congress. And for that reason, it's become fairly partisan. And do you remember the tool? Yes, the Senate has the power of advice and consent. But what's the tool the minority has been using to stall? They're not voting people out. They're doing something else. They're stalling. So instead of let's go to an up and down vote, the minority party, regardless of whether it's been Republican or Democrat, has been using what technique to stall? The hint is stall. To kind of drag on these appointees. What's the Senate? Go ahead, Jenny. The filibuster, right? But they haven't really even been using the filibuster. What have they been using? The threat of the filibuster, because it comes down to numbers. How can the threat of a filibuster indefinitely kind of drag out an appointee? What do you need? What do you need to end a filibuster? What's the procedure? What's the number? You need to be able to invoke cloture. Does anybody remember the number?
60.
Yeah, you need 60 to be kind of to end, the filibuster. Okay, so 61 would be. Let's put it up here. If you have the numbers that deny the other side the ability to invoke cloture, if you have 41 in the minority, they are cloture proof, and they can simply say, we oppose this nomination. We are going to filibuster if you bring it to the floor. Don't bring it to the floor because we're going to stop all business. And then the leadership on the other side decides to kind of pull that nominee. And as a result, appointees languish, right? So what we looked at, and I've kind of mentioned some of these numbers, is starting with Reagan, like a 30-day kind of, it takes a month to get an appointee through. And then when we get to Clinton, we're up to 41 days. When we get to Bush, it's 60 days. I can show you appointees that have been waiting a year currently just for a hearing, just for an up and down vote. There have been essentially agencies and departments that are rudderless, the INS being one of them, okay? Remind me this is where we're at, and we'll pick up with it a little bit more tomorrow.